Hi, so I want to welcome you back to our series, Conversations with Experts, and I'm very excited to have with me today Dr. Gia Marson. I'm really looking forward to hearing what you have to say, so I'm very excited to have you with us. Thanks for being here.
Thank you. It's such a pleasure.
And, first thing I like to ask people is I hope that you and your family and loved ones are safe during this difficult time.
Thank you. Everybody is. Thank God. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm really glad to hear that.
I hope you are too, and all your loved ones. It's just such a strange time.
It is such a strange time, and we are, yes, living very, very carefully at the moment, kind of in lockdown mode, and have been because I have some elderly family members. My dad turned 90 this year, so
Gosh, it's a lot to protect.
yes, a lot to protect. So I wanted to ask you about, people have a lot of ideas about, the term eating disorders gets kind of thrown around a lot, and a lot of people think about it meaning different things, but I was wondering how you would define it, or, I know that this is your area of expertise, and I'm really interested, how you would sort of delineate what's an eating disorder and what isn't,
That's a great question because so many people have disordered eating or different kinds of ways of eating, and they can be for religious practices reasons or health reasons or just preferences. But something really becomes an eating disorder when it gets in the way of your life. So I would say if somebody's rules with food or rigidity around food or exercise or weight and shape interferes in other parts of their life that are really important to them. So if someone can't go out to dinner with their family because they have to control their food to the extent that they want to make all their own meals, then they are having enough trouble with food that it's interfering in the way they're living and other values. And so also with health. I mean, health is primary in eating disorders because it is they are illnesses that impact people's health. So often we see that's the way people end up in treatment, is that it's impacting their health in some way.
Right. Okay. So I think that's really important if it's really interfering with their life or it's impacting their health. And because I think a lot of people, I know a lot of people who have strange eating patterns, or particular preferences or limitations. But yes, if it's actually getting in the way of them being able to enjoy their life, or be healthy, it's important.
Yeah.
Yeah. So what differences have you noticed for people dealing with eating disorders during this pandemic? I mean, obviously, it's a strange time for all of us, but, I just wondered if you'd seen changes in what you see with people.
Yeah, there's really a significant increase in eating disorders and in difficulty with recovery, maintaining recovery, and also new onset of eating disorders. And I would say from the research we have information that points to a couple factors. One is anxiety, that most people are experiencing, or many people are experiencing more anxiety than usual. And there's also, for people with eating disorders, there's often a difficulty with uncertainty. I think we all kind of have a difficulty with uncertainty, to be honest, but
anybody likes it at all.
No. We like to know what's happening. And just something as simple as Thanksgiving coming up or a holiday coming up, and we kind of know what our Thanksgiving is normally like. Even if we're going to someone's house that we have never been to, or we're hosting it, we still kind of have some sense of how that day is going to go, who's going to come. This year is really different. So the rituals that we normally rely on to kind of anchor us in certain ways, they're not there. And so that level of uncertainty is even heightened for people with eating disorders because they like certainty even more than your average person. And so that's escalating symptomatology, as is anxiety. And then the third thing is really food scarcity. So when we have food scarcity, and you see that when people lose their jobs or they're waiting in food lines, it actually makes our brain want food more when we're afraid we can't get it. And so there's this strange thing that happens. And of course, we're wired for survival. It's a good thing that when we're afraid we can't find food, we're very motivated to find it. But in times like this, that can add to symptoms.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I've seen a lot of people with, the anxiety either wanting to control or limit their food intake more because that feels like a sense of control for them, or wanting to comfort themselves with food because of the uncertainty and because of the anxiety and because of the feeling of kind of like, what does it matter, or something, because we're all kind of in this trapped lockdown situation.
Yeah, and some of that is within the normal range. And for those of us who aren't genetically loaded to have an eating disorder, we can kind of float into that space of wanting more control or more comfort with food, and then dip back out with ease and grace, and it's not a big deal. But for people who have the genetic loading for an eating disorder, they can get into trouble pretty fast.
Yeah. And it also seems like it might be harder for people to access resources in terms of getting help right now. I don't know if you've experienced that, but it seems that way to me.
Yeah, I think that not only are eating disorders on the rise, and it's hard enough to find providers who treat eating disorders, but also a lot of providers aren't going into their offices and doing virtual, which is on the one hand convenient and it makes it easier to access. But on the other hand, like a lot of my clients are like, when are you going back to the office? I want to sit in the room with you. I want to, like, they're really missing that quality experience of being human to human in a room together, sharing their story of what's hurting them, what's helping them. And another factor for eating disorders is that if somebody has anorexia nervosa, especially, we're usually doing weight checks. And so if they can't get into the doctor easily or to their therapist, and or if the therapist or dietitian doesn't have a scale, a lot of people are afraid to go into their doctor's offices now, or doctors are limiting that. So the access to scales is kind of an issue too. You don't really want people weighing themselves, but then you get into that kind of quandary of should they weigh themselves or should they risk going to the doctor's office. So it's kind of complicated in that way because there's the medical component.
Right. I understand that. And that, I mean, I have patients who would love for me to be back in the office too, and, it's hard to see when that will be, that we'll be able to go back to that face to face. And so that's a struggle, and I do imagine if there's an added component of actually needing to weigh, that not having that ability is hard.
Yeah, usually when I'm seeing somebody with an eating disorder, they're also seeing a medical doctor and also a dietitian. And so there's 3 people involved, and if they can't access the medical personnel easily or safely, then that's a pretty big problem, because we want to check blood pressure, not just weights, but blood pressure and other things, lab work. So it's a real complication right now that the field is grappling.
Yeah, I hadn't even thought about that part about the weighing or the blood pressure, the medical aspect of it.
Yeah.
So, I think you've kind of answered this, but, one person asked about, the heightened emotions people are experiencing right now and how that impacts their eating disorders or their issues around food.
Loneliness and boredom, sadness, anger, these are all emotions that are very closely related, and loss of control, sense of helplessness, are related to eating disorder behaviors. And so as we think about being in this strange situation with this pandemic, a lot of people being isolated, there's more loneliness, more boredom. People can't engage in the normal coping and fun even that they normally do. And so it does put food and restricting food into this terrible position of being kind of a coping mechanism. Of course, it's not an adaptive coping mechanism, but sometimes it's the best someone can do. And I think it's okay sometimes to comfort yourself with food, absolutely. And it's okay to sometimes skip a meal. But again, when it interferes in health or relationships or other things, then it becomes a real problem. So yeah, those heightened emotions right now it's probably a significant reason why we're seeing the uptick in eating disorder.
Yeah, yeah. What are some factors that contribute to a person developing an eating disorder? You said something about, predisposition, and I was wondering about that, but also what other factors you would see going into the development of eating disorders.
We usually think of eating disorders as developing because somebody has a genetic predisposition, and then they have an environmental condition that kind of allows for it. And then there's another, oh my gosh, sorry about that. And then there's another component, which is the biological, which is kind of like somebody may be predisposed to anxiety, they may be predisposed to OCD, impulsivity, and these factors and perfectionism and things like that can also make somebody more vulnerable.
Mm-hmm. So OCD in itself could be a risk factor for eating disorder. I mean, the link between those two I hadn't thought about as much, but I have seen it with people I've worked with, more control of their eating and, obsessive thoughts about it.
Yeah, and for people with OCD and an eating disorder, unfortunately, the eating disorder often serves to kind of relieve anxiety. So if they feel anxious and urge driven the way somebody with OCD might, engaging in the eating disorder behavior can actually pull the urge down to like feel calm again, or it can pull the anxiety down to feel less intense. So the recovery process is so challenging because we're really asking someone to step into more anxiety, step into more, those places where those urges exist, and just sit and tolerate it. It's so hard. And it's so hard right now because, like you were saying, people are just going through so much. And so to ask them to like further go into some suffering or pain so they can come out the other side is really, it's just harder.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a harder ask. I understand. Even though, it's so, I think so true across the board with feelings that if we aren't willing to go into them, they get stuck. We don't get through them to the other side, like you said. But it is asking somebody to go into something that's, might be quite difficult for them or painful for them to experience. Yeah. What are some signs that someone has an eating disorder? Like if you're a friend and you're kind of worried about somebody in your life, whether it's a family member or a friend, how do you, how can you determine whether it's actually an eating disorder or a problem that needs help professionally, probably?
Well, I would say that my advice to parents would be different than it would be to everybody else, because for parents, we know that early intervention and detection leads to the best outcomes. So for parents, I would say they always should err on the side of caution. If they notice that their child has had significant weight loss, or and that could even mean they see their child as having been in a larger body and now they're sort of more in the average size body. That's still a significant weight loss, right? So I don't mean that they have to be what we would call underweight, but just a significant weight loss, any rigidity around food, or compensating for eating, like, oh, I didn't exercise enough to be able to eat that, or any kind of comments like that. Adherence to diets or cutting out foods or food groups, especially.
Mm-hmm.
I would say for parents, the goal would be to get them right to a pediatrician and a therapist who specializes in eating disorders and try to understand what's happening. It doesn't mean it is an eating disorder, but it would certainly be worth getting it checked out because we know that early intervention is helpful. And for children and young adolescents, we really like to encourage families to very much participate in treatment and utilize the family-based therapy approach, which is basically parents being in charge of refeeding their children with the help of a therapist kind of coaching them. So it's a different kind of therapy, but much more of a cheerleader and a coach for families. But so for parents, I would say don't delay. Act as soon as you notice anything strange going on with food, exercise, body, dieting, that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
If we're talking about a friend or someone in our just relational network who isn't one of our children, then the ways to intervene would be a little bit more subtle. And I would say always just base your comments or any kind of intervention on what you notice. Just say what you observe. I noticed that you used to eat gluten and now you don't anymore. What's that about? Like, that could be disordered eating. It could be someone feels better when they don't eat gluten, or it could be the start of an eating disorder. So just say what you see without any, you don't need to label it as an eating disorder, and ask if they need any help. You know, eating disorders are common, and you just want to make sure that if they need anything, they know you're there and you can connect them with resources. And so I would go off observation instead of making inference about anything, because also we know, and I know you know, that when people are very anxious or depressed, for sure, their appetites change. So we may see weight loss for some in one of our friends, and it may not be an eating disorder. It could just be they had a breakup and they lost their appetite for a couple of months. They might lose a lot of weight, but it may not be related to an eating disorder. They can bounce back pretty fast, probably, once they, as long as they don't have that genetic loading and the other biological factors.
Right. I have seen that with people going through breakups a number of times. And then it, it's a period of time, and when they get through it, you see their eating recover too.
Yeah.
I was thinking about, there are some children, certainly that I've known and that I've worked with, who have very restricted eating of what they'll eat. They're very limited on what will go into their body, mostly things that are white, like white bread or white oats, or, very limited range of what they're willing to eat. And parents who really want them to be eating more, more nutritiously. And sometimes that gets into a real kind of battle, and I think sometimes it concerns me because the battle seems like that might increase the risk for that child developing an eating disorder, not decrease it in some ways, even though I understand the anxiety parents feel when their child's not eating a very healthy diet,
Yeah, so there is an eating disorder that can occur in childhood that's avoidant and restrictive feeding and eating disorders, RFID, which is a clinical diagnosis and probably isn't exactly what you're describing, which is more just a picky eater or a kid who's kind of cut out certain foods. Maybe they even used to eat Brussels sprouts and now they only want, pasta with butter. And so, right. And so, I would say those are two different things. If a child's eating is so restricted that it's impacting their health, so they're not thriving, their weight is not trending with their height growth, then that's possibly a clinical diagnosis. But I agree with you that the battle is probably going to cause more harm to the child and the child's eating than the Brussels sprouts will improve their eating. The cost benefit's not there. it's much better not to get into the food battle and to, just help your child enjoy food and sort of trust the process that humans have gone through times where their foods are limited, and we're pretty resilient actually. And so it's sometimes I think the more nutritional information or fad-based information we get, the harder parenting is, because you kind of forget, oh yeah, I only ate peanut butter sandwiches for 5 years. I remember my mom told me, like you'll start to ask parents these questions and they'll say, oh yeah, I remember I was like that too. And then they're perfectly healthy, but for some reason they think their child needs to be able to eat, these like colorful salads. And I mean, it's great if they will, but if they don't, they'll probably be fine if you don't start back with them. So I'm with you that the relational piece is more important. Having calm at a meal, enjoying meals together, offering a lot of different variety, and then not snacking in between meals and snacks. So most parents give their kids snacks in between meals, which is great and healthy and normal. But if all day long they're snacking, they may not be as hungry at meals. So it can help to kind of limit the in between meal and snacking. And just to offer variety and to not overly focus on what we think is healthy, because actually what's healthy is having a good relationship with food and people. And that's going to actually help more than anything.
Yeah, I like that focus, that it's more on the relationships, not just about the food. It's both, yeah. What are some differences you've seen between men and women with eating disorders? Because I think the stereotype people think of more as women, and maybe there's more of a preponderance, but it's certainly an issue that affects both men and women.
The stereotype that eating disorders affect women more often is still there, and I guess in straight numbers it's true, but we also still miss a lot of boys and men in diagnosis and treatment. So it actually may not be as true as it still seems to be. For binge eating disorder, which is the most common eating disorder, it's almost equal, males and females. So there's not much of a difference at all. For the other eating disorders, there is about 25% males versus females, but that's also not that big of a difference. And that's because we're now paying attention. And I have a feeling as we pay better attention, as time goes on, we'll see even those numbers will rise. We miss a lot of boys and men in diagnosing. And what happens is that because we miss it, we think that's why mortality rate is actually higher for males with eating disorders, so sadly, because there's a delay in getting them treatment and help.
Yeah. I think about somebody I'm working with who is a young man who very, very restrictive around his eating, very severe OCD, but also, and ties it to the exercise. Exactly. I mean, and, his sister got diagnosed with an eating disorder. He didn't, but has very much the same eating she does.
Interesting, right? So there you're seeing it. And we know there's a genetic loading, so it makes sense they would both have them, but we have to ask ourselves these questions. Why aren't we diagnosing boys and men? That's in the same family.
Yeah.
Right?
Even in the same family and with the same pattern. I mean, they send each other bars that, that don't have too many calories. So it's not good, But I mean, it's a shared sort of preoccupation that they have with it too. But
yeah, and I think for boys and men, sometimes we see different types of body image ideals. So then with the females with eating disorders, so we may not recognize it as easily because we see them building their muscles and taking supplements and steroids and different kinds of things, but different kinds of enhancers. But that's no less of a preoccupation, right? And so it may present a little differently. And then the other thing is the hormonal differences. Obviously, when a girl or a female misses her period, it's right away a marker that something's wrong and a reason to go into for a health check if you miss your period a few months in a row and you're not pregnant. But boys, when their testosterone goes down, when they have hormonal changes, they don't notice it in the same way because they don't have that quick marker. And so I think we miss it. You know, they may notice that their sex drive isn't what it used to be, but also a lot of people are on medications that interfere in sex drive. So there's a lot of ways that it gets masked for boys and men that it's just sort of easier to spot in girls because they're not building up their muscles and they're also usually missing their period. So those are two differences I see that make it could give a rationale of why we're missing the diagnosing, but we now know them, and so we should be doing a better job. All of us, me too. I mean, it's just, you know, it's been in the water for a long time.
Yeah. You said with binge eating disorders, there isn't a difference between the numbers for males or females. And, you know, that's, you know, I know that you also have done a lot of work around binge eating and you know, I was wondering, you know, that's another thing that I wonder how do you distinguish between just overeating and where does it become actually binging, you know, kind of line.
So males are still a little less, the statistics are like 40 to 60%, so it's not exactly equivalent, but pretty much. So the line between binge eating and overeating or eating more than someone else would is it's a very soft line, but the way it's described in diagnostic criteria anyway is that it's basically an enormous amount of food in a short amount of time, with a sense of loss of control and a lot more calories than someone would normally eat in that amount of time. And it's something that would happen frequently enough. It's not you wouldn't diagnose someone with binge eating disorder because on Thanksgiving and holidays they eat more, or they have a Sunday dinner with their family every week and they eat more than they normally do, or once in a while they eat a box of cookies.
Right. Yeah.
But it's a real sense of loss of control. I mean, people who have binge eating disorder really describe that they feel like a demon has taken them over, or they just are in a tunnel. They can't stop. They go into kind of this almost, it's not dissociative, but it almost has the feel of something that's like very disconnected. Often it's planned out and ritualized. So it is different I think we all overeat sometimes and we all undereat sometimes, and that's very normal. But binge eating is, people who have it know, because they just feel like they're very different than other people in terms of it's very secretive too. So if you're out with somebody, out to dinner with somebody, and they have a dessert after a huge meal, and you're and an appetizer, and you're thinking, how did they eat that much? I wonder if they have binge eating disorder. No. Most people with binge eating disorder, they're not going to engage in binge eating in public. So if they left that meal and then stopped at the store and bought a bunch of food and then went home and ate it, then they might have binge eating disorder, but it's usually done in secret because there's a lot of shame associated with it.
Right. And I've seen a lot of people with binge eating disorder who eat kind of normally or even lightly in front of others. Yeah. But then when they're alone, like you said, it's that lots of food in a very short amount of time, and often very high calorie food too, like, you know, and almost to the point where they feel sick. You know, it's not a pleasurable experience of food, like like eating your Sunday dinner with your family or Thanksgiving where you're enjoying the food is different than sort of, that compulsive consuming a lot of food.
Yeah, exactly. It's not it's not pleasurable. It's kind of an escape or a way to avoid. We were talking earlier about emotions being intensified during this time.
Mm-hmm.
And there is an emotion escape theory when it comes to binge eating, which is that we have an emotion that we don't feel like we want to tolerate, and then we binge eat to either manage the emotion or escape the emotion and kind of get into some other kind of emotion, which might be guilt, right? So then we binge eat, and then we feel guilty, and then we can just focus on the guilt instead of the sadness or the loneliness. And it may seem like that's a better alternative, but the truth is, of course, that we still have the sadness and loneliness, and now we have the guilt and the disgust and the shame and all that. So we're really just layering problems on, but it does at the time feel like a way to cope with the emotion.
Yeah, no, I have seen that, and it has a very, I do a lot of work on suicide prevention. It has a very self-destructive feel to it. It feels like a way of annihilating the self in a way, or it doesn't. Again, it's people think of eating a lot of food as pleasurable in some way, but it's not in this situation at all, and it's very self-destructive.
Yeah, it's interesting because on the one hand, yes, it's not pleasurable, but the ritual is pleasurable, right? So it's like there is some way that it's some kind of a soothing process because the ritual soothes and it is an escape. But in the end, pretty quickly, it brings someone's mood way down, even from what it was before the down mood that led to the binge.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes people binge when they're having a positive experience. I have one client like that, but it's much more unusual. And that, at least for the person I'm thinking of, it's related to trauma, childhood trauma, where there wasn't someone to share good experiences with. So when this client has good experiences that are very positive and meaningful, there's this desire to sort of have it extended or fill up on something, or there's some need that wasn't met in those positive experiences early on. So looking to food to kind of fill that, and replace the relationship, the person that they wanted to be there.
Yeah. And I do see the ritual part of it as self-soothing. I understand that part. It just seems like the person that usually ends up feeling, like you said, even worse than they did before the binge, which was probably not positive for most people.
Absolutely. And there's so much shame and self-loathing that goes on for people who have binge eating. Most people don't even come to therapy for binge eating, which is why I recently wrote a book that's a self-help book, because we know that people, even when they show up for therapy, it's usually 8 years after the average is 8 years after the onset of binge eating disorder. And they don't even say they have binge eating disorder. They come in for the fallout of the binge eating disorder, which is depression, self-criticism, isolation, shame, all those kinds of things. And so it's not even really the food that they're talking about. So we really need to get more self-help resources out there, because we're a culture that's obsessive about quote unquote healthy eating, having control, all these things that make people with binge eating feel even more shame.
Yeah, right. And an ideal around what we're supposed to look like that often would require almost an eating disorder to meet, in terms of thinness, especially for women and all of that. And so to admit binge eating is pretty difficult in that very unaccepting culture.
Yeah, it's really hard. It's really hard to admit it. And the shame of not being able to control, it's like, and like you said too, the idea that our bodies are supposed to look a certain way, we get so many messages about that. And the obesity focus that we have now is really not serving anyone well in terms of binge eating, because the more we focus on people's weight, the more people want to diet the more diets fail, the more people feel bad about themselves, the more people want to diet. Then they fail, then they feel bad. It's just this cycle. And so it's a really big problem. And I'll have people come into my office and say, well, look at me, you can tell I'm not healthy. And it's because their bodies are larger. And I'll say, well, how would I know if you're healthy or not from looking at you? I can't tell anything from looking at someone unless you look tired or you're sneezing or something. And they'll say, well, look how big I am. And I'll say, well, I can't, size is not a correlate with health, you know? Really hard for people to get that weight and size and shape are not, they're not stand-ins for health.
No, and yet they sort of, get those messages from all the popular media that you consume. So it's not helpful, like you said. And the beating themselves up after binging, or the self-criticism around weight, that doesn't lead to anything good. I mean, I have a lot of people of like, if I didn't beat myself up, I'd eat even more or whatever. No, I don't think so. I think that the beating yourself up is part of the problem that leads to distressing feelings that you want to then soothe with food. That it's part of the cycle. And so let's challenge and move away from beating yourself up, because this is just not helpful.
Yeah, which is where, mindfulness and these kind of self-compassion therapies come in, because if someone can say, okay, I messed up yesterday, I binged, okay, today I'm going to eat normally, they would be in a much better position than, I binged yesterday, so now I can't eat breakfast or lunch, and then I'll eat a small dinner, and then I'll do that again for 3 more days, and then I'll go back to normal eating. Because of course that won't work. They'll end up binging again and then feel like a failure again. So that self-criticism, yeah, it has such a rebound effect. That's so negative.
Right, and it leads to behaviors of restriction then that set you up for another binge. So really, really not helpful. You mentioned mindfulness and self-compassion. How do you see those as important in working with people who have eating disorders, or for people to use themselves to help themselves?
I mean, self-compassion is always good, because we do have this idea that when we have these punishing self-critical thoughts, it's going to toughen us up and make us better. But the research doesn't show that, right? The research shows us that when we feel better about ourselves, we take better care of ourselves. And I think we've all had that experience if we've been fortunate enough to ever have a car, and we've had it, whether it's a new car or new to us, we treat it so well in the beginning, right? Because it's new, it's special. And so if we feel good about ourselves, we're going to do the same thing with our bodies and ourselves that we do with that new car or new to us car, where we take really good care of it. And so it's not true that when we beat ourselves up, we do better. It's perfectly reasonable to notice what we can improve, and I think that's how we do improve and grow. But self-compassion is so important, and I always just like to think of it like, what would you say to a friend? What would you say to a friend if they did that? And that's how we get to self-compassion. It's kind of so simple in a way. I know that if we read, Kristen Neff and different people who are the experts in this field, they have more to it, but I think in some ways it can be as simple as saying, what would you say to your best friend? What would you say to your favorite family member, about that? And then we can get to self-compassion pretty fast. And that can put us back on the path to more normal eating instead of binge eating or restricting. And then we're quicker to bounce back from a negative cycle.
Right. We wouldn't suggest to a friend or a close family member that they should restrict or binge. We would suggest nice normal eating, that treat yourself nicely and give yourself what you need. And
yeah, absolutely. And then when I think about the mindfulness-based eating programs, they're really helpful because they kind of remind us to check in with ourselves right before we eat a meal or a snack. And this is something I'll recommend to clients. Instead of just sort of being impulsive around food, to really check in with our bodies. How hungry am I? What sounds good to me right now? What are my taste buds wanting? What kind of energy do I need? Am I going to go out and run a 10K today, or am I going to study, or am I going to not feeling well, so I'm going to get back in bed, and so I need things that have like really good nutrients because I'm not feeling well. What does your body need? What are your taste buds wanting? How hungry are you? So really checking in mindfully with those body sensations and thinking about food not just as pleasure, because it is pleasure, but also a source of energy and a source of medicine. Like it really is a nutrition for our bodies. It's where we get our health, a part of our health anyway. So thinking about all of those things and just giving gently a gentle guide to how we eat and what we eat most of the time. Not all the time, we're imperfect, but another part of self-compassion, right? We are imperfect.
Right,
Just
right.
all.
Yeah, yeah. It's interesting. I have a friend who just started exercising more, and he now is eating also more healthily. And partly he says, I got to give my body what it feels like. I'm like, yes, it does need nutrition after you're exercising. This is good.
Yeah, that's great. And it's so mindful too, because it's like people think when they start exercising more, sometimes they do it for health, and sometimes people do it for weight loss, right? When you do it for weight loss, it just makes you hungrier, right? So if you're going to exercise more, you also have to honor your body's hunger. And so it's not that it can't or would never lead to weight loss. It could, but you also may get hungrier. And that's something that then you have to be mindful of and notice and respond to appropriately.
Yeah, yeah. But I like that idea of paying attention what did your body need, depending on what state and what your plans, what your activities you're going to engage in and how you're feeling, all of that. Yeah, much more helpful, I think, than a lot of the ways people think of approaching dieting or trying to eat more healthily,
And the intuitive eating approach is so helpful too, because it reminds us to use a just sort of a gentle awareness of what we had previously in the day. So if we're about to make dinner and we're thinking about what did I have earlier today? What did I have for lunch and breakfast? You might notice, I didn't have vegetables today, or I didn't have any green vegetables, or I didn't have any starches, or I really didn't have protein today. That's something to factor in, just sort of in this gentle awareness way. It doesn't have to be, I have to count up my macronutrients. No one needs to do that, but just this awareness that, yeah, during lunch today I could only grab this, and so that's why I want to kind of think about that as I plan for dinner. So it's sort of intuitive, but it's intuitive not just without consciousness. It's sort of adding that conscious awareness of what have I had today, and how is that? What am I missing?
Right, right. And I think that's important to think about, but like you said, not in the way of having to be obsessive about adding up your micronutrients. That's yeah. What do you see as some of the myths around eating disorders or misconceptions people have? Because I think there's a lot of them out there.
Oh my gosh, there's so many misconceptions. So I think the first myth about eating disorders is that it's a choice. Because most eating disorders start with a diet of some sort, people around somebody who develops an eating disorder see it as a choice. So that first restrictive moment is a choice, right? That over-exercise is a choice. That cutting out carbs or cutting out fats or whatever people are doing, fasting, intermittent fasting, whatever that thing is, that moment was a choice, right? Many of us have made that same choice and not developed an eating disorder. So the myth is it's a choice to get out of it, like it was a choice to get in it. And while that's true, yes, it's a choice to engage in treatment. for people with the genetic loading of an eating disorder who are also environmentally impacted by either a sport that requires thinness or an environment that requires it or whatever, some kind of environmental factor, and then the biology of it, anxiety or OCD, like we've talked about, it may no longer be a choice. It's like, boom, they now have an eating disorder. And then once they have that eating disorder, it no longer feels like a choice. And as an outside observer, someone can't tell the difference. But I think it's important to know that once someone has an eating disorder, it isn't a choice. So it's not like, oh, just eat or just don't throw up. It doesn't work that way. It's not that simple. So that's one. Another is that we've talked about the gender differences and that, that males don't develop eating disorders. That's absolutely not true. Another issue is that we don't diagnose eating disorders as frequently in the people of color populations because we aren't as aware of differences in BMI, body shapes, and things like that. We're going off sort of this one standard, and it is not, there's no normative body shape or size because depending on your genetics and your activity level and your, race and different things, you may have a completely different body type and be just as healthy or unhealthy. So that's another stereotype that's really problematic and causes underdiagnosing.
Yeah.
And then the other one that I think is really important, there's a bunch, but the other one that I think is really important is that families are to blame. As psychologists and therapists, unfortunately, we have blamed families for doing things. I feel strong.
We have that stereotype. I know.
Right? And it happens in eating disorders where we blame families. We see, oh, well, you're overly this or overly that, or you shouldn't have Cheetos in your cabinet, or you shouldn't go on only exercise vacations, or you shouldn't have said this or done that. Families are not to blame for eating disorders. We pass on genes to our children, our biological children, and then they have that biology, they have the genetics, and that's what they're stuck with. In addition, we have these environments that we all live in and have to function in with these messages that are pretty risk, they cause high risk.
Yeah.
What we know is that families can be our best allies in the recovery process for children and adolescents, our best allies. And I say that to coaches too. So we can blame coaches if they're in the coaches of sports where there's a thin component or a muscle component. Most sports have something like that. And we can blame coaches, we can blame families. But instead of doing that, I like to think, how can we turn them into our best allies? Because if we can, they have so much power, to do good.
Yeah, and they're in the person's environment day in and day out. They can make a bigger difference in some ways than we can, or they can help, support the person in ways we can't,
Absolutely. I mean, I'll say to parents, look, you know exactly how to feed your child. You were feeding your child just fine until they developed an eating disorder. It's not you. Something shifted and caused the eating disorder. You are not the problem. You know exactly, like, you know how to feed your children, you know how to feed yourself. Like you said, even in a family where there's other children with eating disorders, that's the genetics coming out. So we really like to empower parents to get back to doing what they do best, which is parenting. And part of parenting is making sure your children have enough food and eat enough. So we kind of empower parents to be those allies and be nurturing and yet strong about not taking no for an answer because their child's life depends on it, because eating disorders are life threatening. And so in some ways eating disorders cause a crisis in a family, and that's a reasonable crisis because their child's facing something life threatening. at the same time, they know exactly how to feed their children. And so we try to both help them tolerate that it's a crisis, while at the same time giving them the support they need so they can do what they always knew how to do before their child developed it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I think that's really important. What do you see as some of the pitfalls around dieting? Because there are all these diets out there. There's all these different messages about, oh, no, this is the healthiest diet. No, this is the healthiest diet. No, you should be eating like this. And even for people who aren't trying to lose weight or just trying to be healthy, it's confusing.
I always say food is the wild, wild west, because we have so many messages that are just outrageous. And depending on the mood you're in and the day and the people you're around, you might start following something that's just not reasonable at all. Diets are as likely to be successful as, almost like they're very unsuccessful. I don't even know what to compare them to, but you'd have a better chance of winning the lottery than having a successful diet where you then maintain the weight loss. Because we're wired for survival. This is, we're so arrogant as humans, and we're so ego driven. We think we can override our humanity and our human condition. We're wired for survival. So when we restrict our food, our metabolism slows down to match what's environmentally available to us. And then we gain the weight back as soon as we start eating normally again. So people go on these diets that are either lower calorie, or they change whatever they're changing, fasting or whatever they're doing. And then as soon as they go back to the regular way of eating, their body hasn't gotten the memo that they're no longer starving, and it's still treating them as if they're starving. And so the metabolism slowed down, everything slowed down. It's holding on to everything it can get, every calorie it can get, because it's scared. Our bodies have the wisdom to know to be scared of starvation. Even if we think we're so proud of ourselves, we're following a diet, our body is not proud. Our body's like, nope, this is dangerous. I'm going to hold on to every calorie. And our digestion slows down. Everything just slows down. That's why people get cold, their fingertips get, low circulation, all that, because our body's slowing everything down in us so that it can do with less. And then once we start doing with less and we go back to normal eating, we're going to gain the weight back. So dieting is just, it's a fraught endeavor that very rarely works. The only thing that works is making changes that are based on real health information, which is available to people. If you look at the Harvard Healthy Plate of sort of balanced eating, if you read the Intuitive Eating book, if you look to resources that are really based on balancing different food groups and giving your body what it needs, you're going to be the shape and size you're meant to be. And that's just where you land. We don't get to decide the number on the scale. We don't get to decide our size. It's just where we land when we're eating well and we're taking good care of ourselves. And some people might also have a preference for certain foods that our bodies don't need, and that's okay too. They may end up in a bigger body, and there's nothing, as long as their cholesterol's fine and their blood pressure's fine and their health markers are okay, they don't need to diet. You only need to make the changes to shift the health marker. It's not about weight. And so I like to take the focus off weight. Even when somebody has any kind of a health issue, if they're told to lose weight, I would say to them, well, ask your doctor, what's the exact marker we're trying to change? Is it cholesterol? Is it blood pressure? Is it my sugars? What is it? and then go to a dietitian, a registered dietitian, and ask, okay, here's this health marker that I've been told I need to change. What do I need more or less of to change that health marker? Take the focus off weight. And I think that would be sustainable, because that's a very big value. We all want to be healthy. And
Right.
so it's still tricky to do because our environment's filled with all kinds of foods that easy to access, but at least then we're at least barking up the right tree. We're like trying to change the health marker of cholesterol or whatever.
Right, right. And so it's interesting. There's two things that struck me. One is the idea that we end up the weight that our bodies are meant to be, whatever that is, if we eat healthy, and that it may not be the meet society's ideal of the, being as thin of a piece of spaghetti. That might not be your genetics or your natural body shape. And that's okay, and helping people deal with the self-criticisms of not meeting those ideals, you know what I mean? And that's a different problem than changing their eating. It's changing how they see themselves or their image of themselves, or what they think they're supposed to be, and how those images match up. But also, when you're saying about, trying to go for the health markers, that seems like a much better way to go, where you're trying to make sure that you're healthy. And so if your sugar's out of balance or you're eating too much this, or, that's a different thing than, trying to just, restrict altogether or something. And maybe that's not even going to help with those markers,
Exactly. I mean, because we can achieve weight loss in the short run through a lot of different mechanisms that may not impact those health markers, depending on what it is that's off for us. I mean, I don't know about you, I grew up, I'm Italian and Jewish, and I'm a curvy person, and I always was. And I remember the age when Levi's were big. I love Levi's, probably because I was never the Levi type of girl, because they're made for boys, right? Now they also have girl versions of them, but I remember thinking, oh, I wish I didn't have these curves so I could fit in Levi's the way my friends do, and then Guess jeans came out. I was like, yes, a curvy jean, right? It's like we put so much pressure on ourselves to be a way that our bodies are not. And of course, as I've gotten out of middle school, I realize that. But those are tough, because we have these ideas of what someone's wearing, or a certain store or a certain brand it really does cater to a certain type of shape and size, or a certain type of look that may not be ours. And so another part of mindfulness, right, is sort of accepting what's true right now, and accepting reality, and being present in the now, right? And if you know that this is who you are and this is how you are, accepting that is the way to kind of not get caught in that diet cycle.
Yeah, no, I relate to your story quite a bit, actually, because I also am a curve and developed early. And so, didn't look like everybody else at one point in middle schools. I think middle school is a nightmare for everyone. No matter what you look like, it's just, I don't think it's an easy time period, because people are going through so much bodily change and, and emotional change, and your brain's reorganizing and everything that's going on. It's just a lot, at that point. But I do think, that idea of being more accepting of who you are and what's natural for you, and that idea of body image. I find so many people look in the mirror and they see somebody who's much bigger or much different than what other people see. And I think that's an interesting thing, that body image is, for many people, pretty distorted or not, accurate.
Yeah, body image is really tough because it is an image, it's a perception, it's not a fact.
Yeah.
But it's very hard to convince people of that. They feel like it's a fact.
When you feel like I'm this,
yeah. And so trying to talk someone out of their feelings is not possible. Trying to talk someone out of facts is possible, but if they think their feelings are facts, then you have a whole nother problem. And body image is that. It's a feeling. And time again, anyone watching this can notice that on a day that you're feeling really happy and great and things are just going your way, you're going to feel good in your body. Most likely, as good as you ever feel. And then on a day when you're feeling worse, and it could be actually the same day 4 hours later, you feel worse in your body. So it's a projection of our mood to a large degree, and just it's a part of us. When we feel yuck, we feel yuck, and it's so easy to place it onto our bodies because we get all these messages about how to fix our bodies. So it's just sort of this easy dumping ground, and I think we should stop. I'm probably not going to talk people out of that today, but noticing how your body image changes with your mood is helpful, I think, because it kind of gives everybody insight into, oh yeah, maybe it's not a fact.
Yeah, I think that's so important. And you're saying that families aren't the problem, and I think it's not that they cause eating disorders, but I do think some families have a focus on being thin. We're all thin and active in our family, or, we all have to look a certain way, or something really wrong if somebody puts on weight, or, don't have an accepting attitude, and that doesn't help, with those comparisons made, for instance. Or
absolutely. And I think, unfortunately, the messaging we give as a culture about weight and shape and size trickles down to parents. So they can be part of the problem because they're part of our culture and our society. But I would say to parents, don't talk about weight and shape of yourself, because children are watching and they're listening. Don't talk about other people's weight and shape. Your children are watching and they're listening. And don't talk about their weight and shape, because they're definitely watching and listening to that. If they bring it up, have a conversation about, well, what does your body do for you? What do you like about your body? What does your body help you with? Try to go to gratitude. Get off the focus on judgment around body shapes and sizes, because that's how we're going to eventually be able to make any dent in this societal obsession with thinness.
Yeah, I think that's really important, and it would be great if we could get off of that as a society too, because it's just not helpful messages and all the images that we get. And I think there's some moving away from that, but not, we're certainly not there yet. We're in a process, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, some schools, I recently had to write a letter for someone whose school was doing weight checks. The PE teachers are doing weight checks in some schools. I mean, can you imagine what training do PE teachers have about healthy bodies and healthy minds? That is a very dangerous practice. Yeah. I think it's not very unusual.
Source for humiliation potentially for kids, or
Absolutely. I mean, these should be healthcare workers that are, doctors, nurses, physicians assistants, nurse practitioners. These are the people that should be weighing our children, dietitians, so that they can look at the trend and make sure a child is growing at the rate that they've been growing at, and they're not falling off their curve, up or down. And if they are, they can make kind and thoughtful and intentional comments and changes by incorporating parenting into that, instead of talking to a child about, how fast you ran the mile and how much you weigh, and linking those together, or making any other kind of off. And look, I love PE teachers. I think it's great that kids are able to have fun and do play in school and activities, but it's a very dangerous practice to have such a focus on weight, even in schools.
Yeah. And earlier you mentioned registered dietitians, because I think there's a lot of people who are self-proclaimed experts on nutrition, but maybe don't have the training or experience to be doing that. So if a family or an individual is wanting to consult a dietitian, it seems like it's important that they're a registered dietitian.
Yeah, so the term, if somebody has an RD after their name, they're a registered dietitian, and a nutritionist is an unlicensed term.
Okay.
And kind of like for us, how a therapist is not a term that's affiliated with a license. So I usually introduce myself as a psychologist because that is a term that people know comes with a certain credential. It's not that I think I'm any better or worse than a marriage and family therapist or a psychiatrist or a licensed clinical social worker, but all of those have a credential associated with them. It's important for people to get whatever treatment they want from someone who has had the training and practice that they need. And so registered dietitians get great training and practice, and they know what they're doing. They're really smart. They have a lot of information. They're not going to, usually they're not going to tell people to get onto these fad diets, they're just not. And they're going to be able to guide you or your child or whoever. But there's a lot of nutrition programs out there that are certification programs and things like that that give you just the tip of the iceberg. And if you don't have further knowledge about what's happening underneath on a metabolic level, on an endocrine level, on a cellular level, you don't really know how those changes affect different people. And that's what registered dietitians have. They have that, like microbiome. They're taking all those really tough classes that I wouldn't have wanted to take. And they really know that stuff. And so I think looking for a registered dietitian is really important.
Yeah. So I appreciate that distinction being made, because I've heard people get advice from all types of people, but they may not have the expertise to really know what they're talking about and give you the right information. Yeah. We've talked a little bit about body image in the popular media, but how do you see the popular media and all of the social media use and all of that is affecting people in terms of what they're coming in with around their ideas around eating and body image?
There's good news and bad news. The good news is we are embracing more diversity in popular media, and also people we revere, I guess, who are entertainers and things like that, which is great. It's still not where it needs to be, but it's, hopefully moving in the right direction. And to that degree, people are able to see more people like themselves, whether it's in entertainment or, doing the news or whatever. At the same time, with social media and also with social media, there's like an ability to really connect more with people, which is a good thing relationally, of course. But on the downside, there's the ability to manipulate photos. And when people manipulate their own photos, it's shown to cause more body dissatisfaction. Strangely, you would think you manipulate your photos and you put it out there, it could make you feel better. It might make you feel better in that moment, but basically the more manipulating you do and the more manipulating of photos you take in as a consumer, it does trend with body dissatisfaction, which is one of the vulnerabilities for developing an eating disorder. So if we could focus on not digitally manipulating photos and also not engaging in comparing ourselves to other people, we can appreciate how beautiful someone is or how attractive they are or how fit they are without saying, and that makes me bad, their success or goodness or whatever doesn't reflect on me at all. I can just appreciate that person. I can love that about them. I can love that for them, but it doesn't mean anything about me. And so in taking in social media, it's important not to personalize those things and not to get into comparing and I think we do a good job of curating certain parts of our lives, but we haven't learned to do a good job of curating our social media and our media and really thinking about the effect it has on us.
Mm-hmm.
And I would challenge everybody to think about how you feel before and after you go on a certain website, or you
Mm-hmm.
engage with a certain Instagram, or whatever it is you do that's
Yeah.
media, social media. How do you feel before and after? If you feel good in that, like it's helping you be your best self and move toward your values, then fantastic, keep it. But if it's making you feel bad and self-loathing, or you want to diet, or you want to engage in all this criticism of yourself or comparisons, then get rid of it. Curate your social media and your media. I think it's really important. We haven't really been taught to do that. And
Mm-hmm.
I think that part of media literacy that we haven't really gotten good at yet.
Yeah, I've really seen that come up during this pandemic, where people will take in news after horrifying headline, all written to catch your attention. But that make it seems so depressing, and seems your anxiety is going up and up and up, and that's not good for you, especially right before bed, or when you wake up in the morning. You just don't need that, adrenaline, or anxiety, stress.
Yeah, and I just noticed that for myself, that I was getting up in the morning and I was turning on the news, and I used to do that and it was okay, but recently I noticed that I was running late in the morning. I mean, I do run late anyway. That's just one of my downsides of me. Um, but also, I just was noticing that I was feeling anxious and sort of distracted. And so I've stopped all of that in the mornings, and I just still do my sacred morning practices of meditation and coffee drinking, which is a sacred practice for me, and being with my dogs, and just like having this calm, peaceful, intentional morning. And it's just a reminder to me of how much those intentional hours in the morning make a difference, because
Hmm.
they set the course for the day in a
Yeah.
way that evening rituals set the course for sleep. But for me, I recently had to remind myself of this exact thing that I already know, and reinstitute my own best practices. It's
Yes.
making
Yeah. Yeah. I think we should always be sort of paying attention to, is this making me feel better or worse? This taking this, and moderate it. And it's 10 hours a day of news feed is not going to get you that much new information. They're mostly saying the same things over and over again. So, we need to know the facts of what's going on, or where things are, especially if they're safety related. But they don't change that much, and we don't need to know all day long, every day. It just doesn't help. We don't get new information. If somebody is recognizing through maybe even this this conversation, that maybe they do have an eating disorder, or something that they need to address, what do you think the best way of dealing with that is right now, and given the times that we're living in?
I would look for a specialist. There's three professionals that really specialize in treating eating disorders: registered dietitians,
Okay.
licensed therapists who specialize in treating eating disorders, or medical doctors or nurse practitioners who have an awareness of eating disorders. And I would say any one of those types of professionals would be a great entree point into getting help. The National Eating Disorder Association, NEDA, and the Academy for Eating Disorders both have great resources on the websites. So if someone's just wondering, do I have an eating disorder, or do I have disordered eating? Do I overeat, or do I have binge eating disorder? You can go on those. They have really great resources on both sites, and even do a chat or something and ask some questions and get some more feedback. You can probably even get referrals through those sites. And, there's help out there. There's definitely help out there in this time. There's a lot of generosity in terms of treatment centers offering online support groups and things like that. But I would say to take that next step. If you go on in, if you look at resources and you think you might have an eating disorder, don't delay getting help, because the best outcome comes with the least amount of time delay. With binge eating disorder, we know there's usually a pretty big time delay, but fortunately, binge eating disorders, it's the most common eating disorder, but it's also the one people recover the best from, even if there's been a delay. So all you need to do is go get the right kind of help, which is from someone licensed who really knows what they're doing with eating disorders, and get the tools that work, and you'll be on your way.
Right. And that people can still access therapy during this time. You know, you're working remotely, as am I, but you know, that people are still out there. It's not, you don't have to endanger your health to get the help. You don't have to do something that you're not comfortable with from a safety standpoint. You could get help online. You can get help from any of those kinds of professionals online. A lot of medical people are giving, you know, help online as well as psychologists and therapists of various stripes. And you also have some self-help materials, like for people with binge eating disorders, you have a workbook, and that's something people could access online too.
Yeah, absolutely. The workbook that I just published with Danielle Keenan-Miller, who's works at UCLA in the psychology department, she's brilliant. Felt very fortunate to work with her. We wrote a book called the Binge Eating Disorder Prevention Workbook, and it is a guided self-help workbook. It's all the treatments that work. Tools are in it. So there's mindfulness tools, relationship tools, emotion management tools. And because we're all unique and everybody's binge eating disorder has a different way of showing up, whatever someone is struggling more with, there's a tool in that book, in that workbook, and then there's exercises and practices. So you can do it with the help of a therapist or a dietitian, or you can do it completely on your own.
Yeah, so I think that's a really helpful resource for people, because, you know, getting a book where you can actually access the best tools and then modify them to, you know, maybe yours is more relational, or maybe yours is more about having a distorted body image or whatever. It could be very different things for different people that are driving it. That's interesting. I think that's really helpful, because there's no one size fits all, I guess, for this.
Exactly. And some people, it's a few environmental changes, you know, just making some changes in sort of how they lay out food in their house, or how they, instead of eating at the counter, standing up while they're doing other things, just putting it on a plate, sitting down, enjoying their meal, you know, little tips like that, that we all kind of know. But when you're doing a workbook and you're kind of confronted with the science behind the reasons why things work too, it helps you to kind of hold yourself accountable in a different way to really making some changes.
Yeah, I think that's really important. And I think that really, you know, people changing their relationship with food, whatever that is, you know, because it's different things for different people, like you said. And I think these are some of the tools to sort of get there, you know. I think that's really helpful. And I think it's a hopeful message for people out there who are struggling right now, that there is help available and things they can do about it.
Good. I'm glad you think so. Me too. I think so too. And like you said, there's a lot of therapists and dietitians and people doing online treatment and intervention and sessions. So there's help there too. And Psychology Today is another place where people can go to look for help with eating disorders, because they can look in their own area and they can look at people's profiles, things like that. They can look on Psychology Today for articles and contact people who write articles things that resonate with them. So there's a lot of ways in to help. It's just making that step to ask for it. And it's so hard to ask for help, but it's how we grow.
Yeah, it is how we grow. And I think it's so important. And I appreciate you mentioning Psychology Today. It's true. People, you know, the articles on there and people who are writing about it in a way that resonates with you, it's somebody you're going to feel better working with. and because it is such a difficult subject with a lot of embarrassment and shame around it, it matters what kind of, you go to somebody where you resonate with them, So if, your doctor is just telling you to lose weight and not giving you those biomarkers you're trying to meet, that may not be the right person for you. Maybe you need to talk to somebody else about it, who kind of sees, is looking at your overall health as the issue, not just a number on a scale or something,
Yeah, exactly. And sometimes people will not want to go get help because they won't want to be weighed. It can be that simple. They'll want to go to the doctor, but they'll say, I'm afraid of being weighed. And so I'll say, well, tell your doctor, I don't want to be weighed. You can refuse being weighed by your doctor. People don't know that. I guess doctors like to have that down because obviously if they're prescribing medications or different things, these are numbers that matter, just like your lab numbers matter for medications and things. But if that's going to stop you from going to the doctor, you can just say, I don't want to be weighed.
Right.
And
I think people have a hard time telling somebody in a white coat no. We learn to just think we're supposed to listen to those people. So, it's part of our conditioning, but it is important to know you can say no about anything. You don't have to do things you're uncomfortable with, and you can, while it might be important for them to know, they also are looking at you and looking at all kinds of other health measures and, your blood work and stuff. And so they've got an idea of other things that are going on. And, and you can, because yes, I think a lot of people have a phobia about being weighed or, fear about what that's going to say about them, and what's a number that's acceptable and all that kind of thing.
Yeah, and they don't want to be judged. And in defense of doctors, who I work so closely with so many doctors and have the utmost respect for, they don't know somebody has an eating disorder when they walk in the door. So if you say, look, I have an eating disorder, I don't want to be weighed, then they cannot weigh you, and then they can have a conversation with you. Well, would it be okay if I blind weigh you? Would it be okay if I weigh you, but you don't see the weight? So I know, because I am worried about this or that, and I want to factor it in. Then you can, at least it opens up a dialogue about what is it that's scary. And you can see that your doctor is just another human trying to do their job well for you. And they can tell you why it would or wouldn't be important to them on that day to weigh you, and you can just engage in the conversation and see where it takes you.
Right. And I love that, opening up the conversation. And, I think most doctors would be receptive to that, okay, so tell me more about that. I want to, and then they, you can maybe come to some kind of compromise, or maybe you just are going to say no for now, and that's okay. And as you trust them more, you might feel more comfortable. Yeah. So anyhow, I think that's I really appreciate you doing this for us today, and I think this will be really helpful to people and a good resource for people during this time to understand that, here's some of the issues that you might want to think about if you're concerned about having an eating disorder or someone you care about having one, and, here's some actions you can take to really start to help yourself or to help a friend or your child, like you were saying. Parents can be really helpful in intervening early so it doesn't develop into more of a lifelong problem.
Thank you for having me. It was a great conversation with you. I enjoyed it, and I'm really happy to get this information out there, since the health consequences of eating disorders are so scary, and it has one of the highest mortality rates of any of the mental health concerns. It's either number one or number two on mortality rate, depending on the stats you read. And so it is really important for people to get help.
Yeah, I agree with you, and I really, really appreciate it. And I think it's been really valuable information that you shared with all of us today. So thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me. And say hi to your wonderful son.
I will. I'm glad I got to meet you through him. Yeah.
Me too.
Yeah, he's doing well. I don't get to hug him these days because we're still, anyhow, he's working from home, so he's being pretty safe, but his fiance does work. She works in a lab, and so she's a lot of times in a clean room in complete hazmat gear anyways, but some of the time not. And anyhow, just because of my dad. it. It's so hard.
It's
When
so hard.
what?
My daughter had coronavirus this summer, and
Oh wow.
is she's an adult, but she lives alone. And I couldn't see her for 6 weeks. She wouldn't, she joked with me that she would take a restraining order out if I tried to get in her apartment because I was so worried about her living alone with coronavirus. She was so sick for a while. She's all better now. I mean, pretty much all better. She still tastes and smell are a little off, but mostly all better. But she lived alone, and she just did a health visit virtually with her doctor, even, and so no one had eyes on her, and it was so tough. And it really made me realize, and she's young, but it made me realize, like, this is such a, it's the people who have it and their carers, like the people who love them too, right? It's
It is
brutal.
hard. It's brutal.
Yeah.
And these separations and these artificial, not being able to, I mean, I get to see Danny and we sit sometimes in his driveway, a certain feet apart, or he comes and sits in our driveway a certain feet apart. But it's, it's sad, and it feels disconnecting in a way that feels so wrong, But, I mean, last summer we were on a 6-day backpacking trip with him and his fiance. He actually proposed on the trip. But spending a lot of time with them in very close quarters, And it's just hard to be away, for this long, and or even just to have that more distant kind of communication. But yeah, you want to keep people safe. So, your daughter wanted to keep you safe. She wanted the restraining order for your safety. We have my dad in a bubble above our bubble where we, nothing goes there that isn't sanitized, and if we want to join in 6 days in isolation and take 2 tests, and then we can go upstairs and see. I mean, I'm actually in that bubble right now because my husband and I did that to go see him and my stepmother and stuff for a few days. But yeah, it's just, it's hard, but you want to respect and keep people safe. And and young people can get really sick. That's the other thing that, this kind of idea that, oh, young people, if they get it, it's no big deal. For some it is, and for some it isn't. And for some it's deadly, and that's just, and for people with eating disorders, or especially who are overweight, I guess the risk is worse.
Yeah, and it's hard to know that some of that research actually is, there's a medical, like a stigma in healthcare when you're treating people who are in larger bodies, and so we're not sure actually. I haven't dug into it recently, but whether it's that they're getting less effective care.
Right. I wonder about that too, because also sometimes with medications it can be different.
Yeah.
Depending on body size. And also I was wondering about, I mean, there's some of the health conditions that can come with a bigger body size, like diabetes, which is a risk factor, but not all people who have bigger bodies have diabetes, and not all people with small bodies don't have diabetes. It's just not,
Right. One of my close friends who was a soloist with the New York City Ballet has diabetes, and she is certainly in a thin body, and was and is one of the fittest person I will ever know. So
yeah, ballet is a rough sport. Yeah.
All shapes and sizes have diabetes and all kinds of things. So I think as soon as we start to say that it's because of someone's weight, again, we just get into that stigma, and it builds all that backlash and shame, so.
Right.
And then, we may not be feeding people. I mean, because in hospitals, then they're worried they're feeding people, and are they, what, if somebody has an eating disorder and they're in a hospital, are they admitting they have an eating disorder? And if they are, what are they getting? And this is it's very complicated. I don't envy the predicament that our healthcare providers, as in hospital settings, are dealing with, because there's so much emergent medical stuff going on, and then they have all the kind of urgent stuff, and then they have the sort of background things that are happening in people's lives that aren't even, really on the table when they come in, and they're really important factors. And I think it can be really, really complicated for everybody. So
Right.
hard.
Right.
Yeah.
And especially when they're so overwhelmed, like they have been at different points in this pandemic, like we saw at the very beginning, and then we're seeing it again kind of with the rise. And that's, I feel for these people who've been doing this for a long time and maybe pretty burnt out too, because it's hard on our medical professionals who are
Yeah.
working with COVID patients. And, they're exposing themselves to a higher viral load potentially and all that. And, you can see how many things get piled up, and then, what they're dealing with.
And like on medical stabilization units for eating disorders, the children that are on those units, for a while they weren't allowing parents in, or if they would allow them in, they couldn't leave. It was like one person can come, but then they have to stay until your child is discharged. I mean, what parent can do that? And then if they can do that, the fallout for the other family members and jobs and all that kind of stuff. But then are you not going to be with your child when they're in the hospital? So there are so many layers to this, and thankfully now it seems like parents are back able to mostly be with their children when they're in medical stabilization with eating disorders, but for a while they weren't, and it was really tough.
Yeah, I can imagine. That's just awful. I hadn't even thought about that part of it. I have a couple friends who've had babies during this time, and it was on and off of whether their husbands were going to be able to be there in the delivery room. And luckily they were in both cases, but one was in June and one just happened. But, that's scary too. But they would have had more friends there if they could have. And we're planning that, as part of their whole plan about having a baby. And then, boom, these circumstances changed everything.
I don't know if you've done any conversations about this topic, but something that I've noticed a lot of with my clients and friends who have had babies is that not having a community of people that you're getting together with when you've had a baby is leading to a lot of mental health distress, because
it really is helpful to have people around you. I agree with you 100%. I know that, in one case, my friend who had a baby in June, they're isolating to come up and be with us so that they can have a community around them periodically. But when they go for doctor's visits, then they have to be out for a couple weeks, because we don't have people who've just been out in the world come back. So anyhow, but it's hard. It's hard to have the support around you that you would want. And that makes such a big difference early on in being a parent. But we did do a talk with somebody who's a specialist on prenatal and perinatal mental health, and I think it was helpful.
Good. I'm gonna watch it.
Yeah, Dr. Kat. She was actually great, and I thought she had a really kind, compassionate perspective. So it was really good. Yeah.
Oh, that's nice. Oh, good. Thank you for doing these. This is really great.
Thanks for doing it with us. I've loved these conversations, and it's kept me having a piece of my professional identity that I lost, talking with other colleagues, which, is just something that's harder to do with a pandemic going on.
Totally. I agree. Thank you. And please say hi to Dan for me.
I will. I'll say hi to Dan. I hope to see him soon. We'll go visit. Okay. Thanks.
Bye.